Laprade Show continues on City News.
101.1 FM and 1310 AM.
Really looking forward to this conversation today regarding Dr. Kieran Moore and the transparency with the media. And this is my first conversation today with Patrick Fafard. Hi, Patrick.
Hello.
Patrick is the Senior Investigator, Global Strategy Lab Professor at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Social Science and Faculty of Medicine. Patrick, if I take you back to March, April, May, June of 2020, many of us don't want to go back there, obviously, but if I take you back to that time, I certainly remember from my perspective here at City News, I was on the air for pretty much the first 90 days of COVID, every single day, 7 days a week, and had lots of conversations with Dr. Kieran Moore. And he was very much held in esteem. He was very transparent, a very easy communicator. And would you agree with me on all those fronts?
I think so, but for two reasons. First, early on in the pandemic, Dr. Moore was the medical officer of health for Kingston. He had yet to move up to the provincial level. And two, more importantly perhaps, early in the pandemic, what we really, really wanted, we all wanted to know, what is this thing? How big is the risk? What's going on? What do we need to know? What do we need to do? So at that point, the Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province and Dr. Moore at the Kingston level was essentially the explainer-in-chief. Here's what's going on, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And then, subsequently, and joining with the minister, this is what the province is doing. The second thing was, at the local level, Dr. Moore was saying, I, as the medical officer of health, I have authority to do some things. I'm ordering this. The Board of Health for Kingston is ordering that we do this. And so the sort of degrees of freedom or the sort of flexibility they had at the beginning was quite large because we're all going in the same direction. We all want to find out what's going on and we all want the government to do something.
Mm-hmm. It was such an interesting time. And then we know, of course, Dr. David Williams was in that role. There seemed to be some tension between him and the Premier. We know that many times, Dr. Williams, the analysis was that he was being silenced in some ways, and things were changing sometimes, and it felt very political with Dr. Williams. Would you agree on that front?
I would tell that story slightly differently. As the pandemic wears on and governments make ever more difficult decisions, people begin to say, well, I'm not sure I like this. I'm not sure that what the government is doing is appropriate to the risk that I think I face as a person, or experts began to say, well, no, you don't need to do that. You could do it this other way. And so part of our problem was we realized, this is more complicated and people disagree. So Dr. Williams was in this tough spot because part of his job is to advise the Premier and the Cabinet, which he did. But at some point, it's not a matter of public health and science. It's a matter of, very difficult decisions about, so what balance do we want to strike between protecting ourselves against the virus and lockdowns and mask mandates and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Those are ultimately normative or value-based decisions, or if you will, political decisions. And so over time, it ceased to be a matter surely of, we need an expert. And that's where you began to see tension, or at least not a perfect alignment between what the government was trying to accomplish and a pure public health message.
And when Dr. Williams decided to retire, I think a lot of people in the province were thrilled to see Dr. Kieran Moore step into that role. It certainly was a challenging role. I wouldn't want those jobs for anything in the world. It was a very difficult position both of them were in. But he in many ways went from being very communicative to not being very communicative and to cancel interviews and to not sort of have that kind of access. Do you think that plays into the narrative you just said a minute ago, where that's all just part of the way that the pandemic was going, or do you think that was political? I'll call it interference.
Okay. We need to put this in context. The Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Moore, and his counterparts across the country are almost unique in the government or in provincial governments. and for that matter, Teresa Tam at the federal level, because most public servants are anonymous. That's the way the system is designed. When the government speaks, it's usually the minister, unless it's a technical matter. The whole idea of the Chief Medical Officer of Health is we're going to name this person. They're going to have a high public profile because it's all about trust. We want the public to feel that they can trust the decisions that are being made. And if we put an expert in public health and medicine out front, that will reassure the public that the decisions are not purely political. So that's the first logic. And that's why we want them to be independent and autonomous. And Dr. Moore, when he was in Kingston, that's sort of what he was doing. But at the very same time, these are public servants. CMOH is a bit different, but they're subject to the regular rules of the public service, and we want the government to be sending a single message, that there be consistency of messaging, and as the pandemic wears on, and the issues are a mix now of value conflicts and good public health practice, at which point the government goes, oh my goodness, who should be speaking for us? Gee, and so they begin to be concerned about consistency, but also they don't want the chief medical officer saying things that are at odds or in tension with what the government's choices are. This creates a tension that becomes increasingly hard to manage over time, and at some point, it would seem that the Ford government decided to engage in lots and lots of message control, at which point everybody gets confused. Because it's like, hold it, I thought this person was supposed to be independent and autonomous, which they are. But at the very same time, the government has this other objective of consistency of messaging and making sure its message is getting out.
Thank you for that, because that was very, very helpful. And I think when... we were told so much, obviously, rely on the science, and we know the divisiveness that has caused. We don't need to go into all of that, but we were told rely on the science. But we really haven't heard, to your point about the fact that we put this person out there, we name them to build the trust. It's hard to build trust with someone that you don't have access to.
Okay, two quick comments. First, rightly or wrongly, governments at the beginning of the pandemic, and it varies from country to country and province to province, banged the drum of follow the science, follow the science. And Premier Ford really liked that phrase. And it was partly a strategy to say, look, this isn't political. We're just doing what the expert scientists tell us to do. But that was never true. Let's all be very clear. And in fact, you don't want it to be true, because really tough choices like this, you want the cabinet and the minister and the premier to balance all of the voices arguing to go in every sort of which direction, and you want them to make the decision. So in a way, saying we're just following the science is a bit of a shift of responsibility. Over time, it gets worse because, of course, over time the controversies get bigger, and so now, having said we're following the science, when it becomes very clear they're not doing that, then people go, well, hold it. That sounds a contradiction. But it's because, at least in Ontario and a couple of other provinces, they overstated it by a country mile that they were just following the science, which they never were. And so then again, the public's confused. And the other thing in Ontario that's important to remember is you'll recall that the Ontario government was slow to respond at least a couple of times over the first 2 years. And at some point, people were saying, well, we need. What does the scientists say? And the scientists are saying, well, the government's not acting very fast. At which point everybody's even more confused, because now we have, the science seems to say you're supposed to do X and you're not doing it. And Dr. Williams and then afterwards Dr. Moore are caught right in the middle. And there's not much they can do.
Okay. I guess I guess I'm disappointed, to be honest with you. Just as somebody that, I interview anywhere between, really 16, 24 people a day. We would love to have more access to, to someone like Dr. Moore. And when when the province of Ontario was basically one of the longest standing provinces of anywhere in the world to have lockdowns, there is still lots of questions from COVID. I think we're not done, right?
We're not done at all. There's another tension that needs to be mentioned here, is that at some point you wanted to interview Dr. Moore partly because when we were all wondering, either the government is doing too much or the government is not doing enough, depending on your point of view. People went, gee, I wonder what the advice is they're getting. But here's the other problem. In our system, advice by the public service to the Premier and Cabinet is considered to be confidential. It's not typically revealed. It's very exceptional. And so we were essentially asking Dr. Moore and the government to do something that they just never do, which is the root. So, for example, you would never ask to know what advice did the Deputy Minister of Finance provide to the government on the budget. The government speaks for the government on the budget. Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, because this public servant is portrayed as being autonomous, it seemed like a reasonable question. And at some level it is. But in our system, we work really hard to make sure the government speaks with one voice and that the politicians are accountable. Because the last thing you want is the media would quite naturally say there's a gap between what Dr. Moore advised and what the government did. This really erodes trust. Mm-hmm. And so there is a reasonable argument for trying to not make this too public, but it is in contradiction, or at least in tension, with the way the chief medical officer is portrayed as this independent actor. And they are, but only to a point.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. I've had endless conversations as well with Dr. Vera Etches, of course. She was very, very accessible to us here. We still have conversations with her. I guess, I really wanted to kind of take a deep dive into this today because I've really noticed over time, it just seems that it's gone away quieter on the Dr. Moore front, and obviously still a very big job. I would argue, of course, COVID was very intense for a couple of years, but the cleanup, if you will, the debriefing of COVID, I suspect will take a decade.
I think you're right. I don't think the pandemic is over. It could come roaring back at any time, so we should keep that in mind. But the thing we know now that we didn't know 3.5 years ago is that the choices we make are really controversial. Like, as you said, Ontario has among the longest school closures and lockdowns of any Canadian province. And some people think that's a good thing, and a bunch of people don't think that's a good thing at all. But that's not a scientific question. That's how do we want to balance off the risk against the benefit? And so, but your other point is really important. Okay, so now that it's all over, maybe we need to think about this and think about what worked and what didn't work. Mm-hmm. And for me, this is absolutely critical. I think that the role of the chief medical officer and the tensions, if not the contradictions within it, are pretty clear. And government's going to have to make some choices sometime in the next year or two. So in anticipation of next time, what do we want to do differently? Mm-hmm. And my crystal ball is pretty fuzzy. I'm not quite sure what they're going to choose. But if they just decide to centralize and say, well, we'll take the responsibility, well, that's very tempting. The problem is if you take control, then you own it. And so you become responsible, and you can't say, oh, I'm just following the science. Well, no, you've actually taken all the authority onto yourself. So it's a tough choice for governments to make, and we'll see what they do over the coming months and years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously tongue in cheek, but I mean, I wouldn't want my city councilor checking in with my doctor before I was prescribed something, right? I mean, it's a very fine line between politics and what's right for the health of the province.
Exactly. And at the individual level, that would be absurd. But at the population level, for all of Ottawa or all of Ontario, you can't escape the fact that reasonable people disagree on what the best course of action is. Mm-hmm. You can't escape the fact that some people don't think that the science should be as dominant, or as we now know, a bunch of people don't even trust the science. This puts governments in a really tough spot. But we're going to have to fix our decision-making system, because right now, I would say at best it's confusing.
Well, and the other thing too, and we have to wrap up, but the other thing too is we were hearing from Anthony Fauci, of course, from the United States, Officer of Health for America. We were hearing from him every day. I mean, I think this is one of those so rare occasions where on any given night you could hear from 5 different medical officers of health if you tuned into any media, right? The time was such a different time in our lives. Patrick, this has been really enlightening today. I hope you join me again on City News.
I would be delighted to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick Fafard, joining us today. Senior Investigator, Global Strategy Lab, Professor at University of Ottawa, Faculty of Social Science and Faculty of Medicine. Fascinating conversation today.